This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. And if you could, please do me a favor and take a moment and leave a rating and review in whatever podcast player you're listening to this on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, doesn't matter. I would greatly appreciate it. And that feedback really helps get other listeners to the show. Also, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to geekleader.com/tip and donate to the show. Thanks so much. All right, Geek Leaders. Today I'm honored to have Heidi Helfand on the show. She's the author of the book Dynamic Reteaming and the SVP of Strategy and Innovation at Artium. And we're going to talk about leadership. We're going to talk about how to build high-performing teams and what to do when some of those teams like shift a little bit and how to reteam them. And we're also going to talk a little bit about, how, senior leaders in technology, operate, some of the things that go on at that level, which I think will be pretty interesting for a lot of us that have moved up into those roles over the years. Anyway, with all that being said, Heidi, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here.
If you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about your background and kind of how you got to where you are today in your career, just to put some context for our conversation.
Yeah, happy to do that. I'm actually a career changer. I don't know. There's a lot of people in tech that maybe start out in one career and then you kind of find your way almost accidentally. I'm trained as a teacher. I used to teach English as a second language at different U.S. universities. Was on my way to get a PhD in linguistics. And then as I was teaching at UCSB over here in California, I started getting into technology, and I wound up joining the first startup I was at as an editor and writer, became an interaction designer. And at that startup, we built products called GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar, the early one, GoToMyPC. And yeah, so I was the 15th employee at that startup, and then it grew bigger. So I was, the IC roles that I played were editing, interaction design. Then I became a technical project manager, TPM, built those kind of groups. Went to another startup called AppFolio, was the 10th employee, and joined there and started coaching teams to be better at what they do. We grew from one team to, I think, about 25 when I was there. And we built software to power property management companies and law firms. Then I found myself at Procore Technologies, which is software for the construction industry. And I was hired in there. I was consulting there and then hired on full time. And I served as a coach for the tech teams. So I was one coach for about 50 teams, and it was an amazing experience being there. Wound up joining another company where they wanted to double in size. I became a VP of engineering growth and then responsible for the engineering team as the time went on. We doubled in size at that company as well. And now I find myself back in the consulting realm with Artium. And at Artium, we partner with different companies to build great software, great teams. We'll join the teams, we'll pair and we'll switch pairs and upskill people while we're building the actual software. So I'm really excited to be a part of Artium.
Awesome. And, it's a very familiar path when it comes to people being accidental technicians, I guess you say, technical people in technology. One of my, actually the guy that was best man at my wedding, he was a band director for a few years and teacher, and he got into web design, web development, and now he leads tech teams as well, which is, pretty fun. And I teach part-time at Winthrop, so I'm big into the educational community. I think it's it's a way to keep me sharp. It's a fun thing to do.
Yeah, you definitely learn a lot while you teach. That's something that I always appreciated. It's a great way to grow and just stretch yourself.
So let me ask you this. What excited you about startups, to go from one startup to another? It seems like for me, startups are stressful.
None of this was planned. Like the first startup I joined, we were together and such a solid team. Really, it felt like we were changing the world. I mean, we were creating and developing screen sharing technology, kind of like we see here with Zoom. right? Like a competitive product. It was very early on. And the team strength was just really, really high. It was inspiring. And as the technology grew and we figured out things like in the very beginning, there weren't a lot of standards for things like forgot password flows, right? Things that are like common front-end design patterns now, like we were inventing those and we were trying to figure out, well, how are they going to download the software? What is the user flow going to look like? Like I was obsessed with all those, all the flows and collaborating with different people about how this could work. And it was like a huge shared project. And we were, times like getting the first customers, getting the next customers, like things like that became just really contagious and just really uplifting to succeed together and to celebrate together. At both of the startups I was at in the early years, we went from no customers to having customers. And in the early days, we would like ring a bell whenever we'd get a customer. It was really fun. And, after a while, like you'd be ringing the bell all day long. So like you stop ringing the bell, then the bell is there as a visual reminder of take time to celebrate. So I think like a lot of that startup energy is really about creating things together, breaking ground, and some of the best times in my career.
So how do you bring some of the experiences from that into a team today that you're working on, whether you're partnering with that team as a consultant or you're, an engineering manager or somebody that has, a team that's, relatively consistent that you're working on projects for? How do you bring some of that energy into, a non-startup environment, a mature product?
Yeah. I found throughout my career that was really interesting. And I noticed this when I was at the third startup where I joined as like employee 800. And we had, in my tenure there, it was like from 800 to about 2,500. So it was on a bigger scale of companies that I had been at the time. And I found myself coming with a lot of empathy, especially for the first team. The first team in the respect of the first team, like the startup team that in many cases was still there at the company. And coaching those team members to have perspective on how the trajectory of their company was changing and things feel different. People always bring up topics like, how do we maintain our culture? It feels so different than it was before. And as these companies grow and they age and change, different processes come into play. At scale, you have to just operate a bit differently. It becomes a different company. What from the early years do you want to kind of continue on? So I think that's really one aspect. Another thing is, and maybe more directly to answer your question, when in an enterprise, I think we find ourselves in the position of how do we catalyze new product development? And I think taking a startup mindset in that case, specifically by starting teams off to the side, giving them process freedom from the existing ways of working and with the other teams can help. And actually recently, I got a lot of books in the background here. I came across this old book. Actually, I do have it right here. This is old book by Carl E. Larson and Frank M.J. LaFosto, and it's called Teamwork. I don't even remember when I bought this book or why I picked it up, but I have a flag here because there's a story of the development of the Chicken McNugget. Have you ever had it?
Yeah.
From McDonald's?
Probably too often.
Okay. I love McDonald's. I love Chicken McNuggets. But I was reading in here, there's also a story about the formation of the development of the IBM personal computer, which is interesting. But I was drawn to the Chicken McNugget story. And in this story, they were talking about, it's akin to the isolation pattern in my book, Dynamic Reteaming, where they had a very small team. I believe it was 3 people reporting to a GM or like very small like that. And that team was isolated. They were not following the ways of working of the existing teams. They were in a different location, working in a different way and developing the McNugget. So I think that there's things that and that's very startup like. There's a story in my book, Dynamic Reteaming, about a team that was within a larger enterprise, and they did the same kind of thing. Their company actually gave them space in a garage facility, which was near their building, and they were able to have that startup vibe, that startup sense, and they were given the permission and the authorization to work differently. And I find that all very inspiring.
Yeah, I did too. We did this thing at the last company I was with. I was managing a web and mobile team. This is back in I guess it was around 2010, right when it was right after the iPhone came out and when they had just opened up the App Store where you could build your own app. So we were like, okay, we were just doing web before that, and our CIO said we need to get into the app space too. Let's look at building an app. So I took my team, and at the time, the whole IT technology, software development engineering group were all, doing waterfall projects, all very basic. And I just took my team and said, okay, we're going to do everything in Scrum. We're going to switch everything up. We're going to take down our cube walls. We're going to, we actually redesigned the cube. So it was just like a big open area around us as one giant cube, with everybody in there. And I had an office at the time, but I moved my laptop and everything into a table right in the middle in front of everybody. So we're going to work like we're a startup and we're just going to do this thing. And we ran through that project. We also did the same process for a mobile ticketing system for the company had, they were an ISP and they had, trucks that went around, troubleshooted cable modems and internet connections and things like that. So we were building a mobile app for the technicians back then too, because we thought, well, let's utilize this technology, not just externally, but internally and see what we can do. And it changed the whole culture of that team. And it was just a fantastic approach. And then we had other teams start to say, hey, we want to do Scrum too. We want to come over. We want to have that environment. And it was fun. It was a good change.
Yeah. And I think what you say is really important because, besides like any kind of framework like Scrum, just the fact that you organize differently in your physical space, I think has an important aspect because it has an important impact because it has a feel that's different. And I don't, sometimes, I'm working from home these days. I go into my office periodically. It's in Santa Monica. And, sometimes I'll go to a coffee shop. Sometimes I'll move to a different room. And I think a lot of that really impacts just the feel of the work. And I think it can be really, really refreshing and energizing and like get across the point that it's different now. If you do that, like with you and your teams sitting differently with that open space, like it's a message. It's like a symbol that things are new and different. And that can be really cool, I think, to like reinforce change.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a good idea too. If I do say myself, but yeah, that was an interesting thing. So you mentioned isolation pattern, and in your book you talk about 4 other patterns. Can we briefly go through those and talk about how that affects reteaming and what does that mean? When it comes to dynamic reteaming?
Yeah. So for this book, Dynamic Reteaming, I interviewed people around the world and they shared stories about how their teams have changed over the years. And, we talked about specific anecdotes and stories because I had these experiences at these startups that I talked about earlier in this podcast. And I was like, was it just us? Was it just like what we experienced here? I worked in a lot of Southern California-based tech companies. And so I was really, really curious. And the more people I interviewed and talked with, the more I discovered that there are actually 5 patterns to a lot of these stories. So, and they represent what I call dynamic reteaming. And they are as follows. So the first pattern is one by one. It sounds very simple. Someone joins your team or they leave your team, right? Somebody gets a new job, they leave. You have a new hire, they join, right? So something that might happen all the time. We talk about onboarding and how to get better at that in the book. So that's one by one. The second pattern is grow and split. Sometimes our teams grow bigger and then they split into 2 or more teams, grow and split. Coincides a lot with hypergrowth or when companies are doubling, tripling in size, when you're going through a growth spurt, for example. The opposite of grow and split is merging. Sometimes teams merge together for a variety of reasons. We've seen a lot of merging in the past year with companies downsizing, having departures, but people get additional responsibilities. Teams join, they combine. So there's stories about that in the book. Isolation, which we talked about. You want to work on something new, form a team, and there's different ways to do that. Put the team off to the side, give them process freedom. So that's isolation. Good. We do it for production incidents that we might come across. We do it to catalyze new product development. Anytime that you want a concerted effort that's separate or apart, and really, I think it helps accelerate that. And then the final pattern is switching. And switching is really sort of a pattern that relates to our own fulfillment in our career and our own learning, plus also sharing and spreading knowledge. So someone might switch from one team to another in your company for the opportunity to work on something different, get refreshed, work on something new. Or maybe they want to switch so that they can work with different people. Sometimes it gets boring working with the same people, on and on and on. You want to change. Yeah. And we can provide those opportunities within our companies. Maybe people will stick around. So switching is about that. And it's also about something that we do a lot of, through Artium is pair programming, pairing, switching pairs, switching people across teams as a way to share information, help each other, teach each other, accelerate the learning while we're building software. So there's something about knowledge spread and redundancy there that is good. So I don't know about you. I remember when I was at first startup, some engineers left who were responsible for the commerce side of selling some of the go-to products. And when those engineers left, it was really painful for those of us who hadn't left yet.
Yeah.
And it's and these are really important features, dealing with money coming in and all of that. And I think for a lot of us, the visceral learning was you need to build in redundancy as a strategic move to, it's think of your future self, think of your colleague's future self. You don't want problems later. It's good to have this overlap. And also, people need to be able to go on vacation and check out and not be the only person responsible for a system. So
absolutely,
you don't want that for yourself, right? So it's even if you don't particularly want to pair, maybe think about, if more than me knows about this thing, I'll have more options later, because we all get tired of what we're doing and need to grow and do something different. So
yeah. And I had a mentor tell me one day that the only way you're going to move up and into your career is to have someone that can come in and take your place. It's if you don't reshare what you're doing and your knowledge, there's no opportunity for you to go anywhere else. Yeah.
That's really wise advice, I think, because it gives you an out. It gives you that growth, and you learn a lot by teaching others. I mean, not everybody wants to be a mentor or teach or do that, but I think really it can really help us. So it's worth considering.
Talk to me a little bit about pair programming and how effective that is. And what do you say to business leaders that tell you that, that just seems very expensive, to do pair programming?
Yeah. So what I've learned about pair programming throughout the years, and I've seen its growth since 2007, I've been in environments that pair. So I guess one thing is, like any other technique or tool, there's no need to be to force it on anyone. You don't want to ever do that with any kind of technique. You want to invite people to it. And pairing takes a lot of energy and stamina, so people need to take breaks. And I find that when software engineers come together and come up with guidelines on how they're going to pair and when they're going to be apart, it's a very healthy thing to do. So we want to work at a sustainable pace together. And also, sometimes we need to work on our own and focus on things. Like if you're doing research on something, you might not really want to pair on that. So I think it's talking, it's like an extension of working agreements or team agreements, right? So for executives that are like, what's that? Why would I have two people instead of one? I think some of the things that I would talk about with that executive would be about quality. For one, shifting quality so it's earlier in the process. By working together with two people, they might notice something that someone else might not notice. Particularly with critical systems, I think is a good idea to do that. Some people work beyond pairs into groups, ensembles, um, or some people call mobs, mob programming, ensemble programming. These are tactics that you can use in the moment for particular reasons, sharing information. I think it's very healthy to switch between these methods, and nobody needs to get religious about only using one way of doing it. I mean, we're people, we need to have input and freedom into how we work. So I think with pairing, you can work on prevention, like more quality assurance as opposed to quality control later. So if we can find any kind of defects or gotcha earlier on, for the executive perspective, maybe it's less expensive or less loops. Well, the cycle time on everything will probably be a bit shorter. The other way, you code, you get a code review, you go back and forth, you get someone to test it, you go back and forth. It's a lot longer of a process that you can tighten up by having two people collaborating together and working on it. So there's that aspect as well.
Yeah, I found that whenever our team is doing something that's novel, something we haven't done before, pair programming is very beneficial, and finding out all the gotchas and advancing forward when it's something new. But I've also found when we're doing something that we do all the time, it doesn't really make as much sense, and it kind of gets a little bit mundane.
Yeah, I think that's where the kind of quality of life and freedom comes in. And we have a lot of techniques in our tool bag. And so how do we want to use them, and how do we want to be together in this experience building software? I think that human side of it is really, really important. I do love the idea, though, with bringing someone on board to your team for the first time and having a first pair. Yeah. Getting introduced to how things work, not being that person that's onboarded that's like way over there looking at the documentation, or here's this folder of stuff, read it. I think it can really accelerate someone's onboarding to have a first pair. And then I think just naturally switching pairs, and teams can talk about the cadence of that. Like switching pairs can be also like hugely enriching to learn. I'm thinking of a quote from an engineer, Sarah, that I worked with before. She's like, even hotkeys, just learning little like shortcuts and other things in your daily way of working. You might not learn them on your own. But again, working at a sustainable pace and taking breaks is important. When I was at the second startup, we used to pair across teams as well and have more than one team be good at something. So for example, many of these team members were actually at the first startup that I was at and felt the visceral pain of engineers leaving in that kind of commerce problem. We deliberately at the second startup had a team that mastered the kind of, we did ACH processing for rent payments. Mm-hmm. So we had a team that was together and pairing and switching pairs. And then they also cross team switched to develop that knowledge in another team. So you had even more people that were familiar with the code base. And like our CTO at the time, John Walker, this was at AppFolio. There's some quotes from him in my book talking about how since we had a tradition of test-driven development throughout the years, and we'd get that feedback, you'd make a change, you'd check in, and you'd see if the test passed, you'd write new tests. Since we had that, it was easier to, jump into new areas, but still having that guide with you, I think can help accelerate that learning.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a really important part. I did want to talk a little bit about like when it comes to, leaders and, having to deal with turnover. We just went through this great resignation thing that happened a couple of years ago. We've had, a lot of shifting, and a lot of that's one-to-one, but sometimes it's more than that. How do you see like leaders handling this stuff? Especially, you being in an SVP role, and how have you seen this in the past?
Yeah, I remember the great resignation times. I, like others, try to read the room and see the industry shifts that are happening, and then We can kind of notice things in our teams. And, honestly, that was a really, really hard time, I think, for a lot of us. And so it's like, if you're having a lot of departures on your team, it affects the mood, right?
Yeah.
If you're a distributed company and you're working all, in these little cubes, like having your online meetings and all that, and everybody's at home, you might not see the departures in the same way that you might see them in person. So there's something about that I think is really interesting, the kind of invisibility of this. But if you're using a chat tool that sometimes you see deactivated next to someone's name, and that feels weird. So as leaders, I think, for one, like at Artium, there's a truth and reality value. For one, leaders need to talk about the changes and include people in the discussions. Sometimes you can't talk about everything. Like sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. You partner with people in maybe your communications team, or if you have an HR business partner to help navigate that communication territory. Because as a senior leader, you have the one-to-one conversations like this. You have and like here, we're in front of an audience. We can't see that audience, but leaders need to communicate out to the wider teams. So I find that you need it's better to say things and to address things than to not talk about things. I mean,
it sounds like what you're saying is transparency is really important in a situation like this.
Yeah, I think transparency is really important. And then you partner with people when you talk about things in front of large groups of people. But I think it's definitely a good time to bring the teams together. That's a great tactic because you can bring the teams together. You need to focus on the work at hand. You need to continue working. There might be some work that needs to get reassigned, or maybe teams merge together. That's a pattern that really comes up when you have a lot of departures. So you need to get the people together and you need to talk about what happened, acknowledge the ending. There's like a liminal phase where people might be like, what is going on here? And, it's very disturbing. And then at some point, you're moving on. There's a book called Transitions by William Bridges that I talk about in my book. It's a grief cycle for a lot of people when there are departures because, and then other people might, it could be catchy. Like other people might want to leave too if this one person leaves.
Right.
And so it's a complex topic that, it can be very, very upsetting. And so I think leaning in, getting people together to talk about the new future, that's the other thing. Leaders want to cultivate the future. What is it going to look like from here? How are we going to be in this together to help our company succeed and all of that? And those kind of conversations can get very visceral, and it's important to do it in person. Even bring in a consultant to facilitate. This is an area of work I do, right? Like you can bring in someone to facilitate to help people acknowledge the ending and move on and look at, well, what's ahead, right? Because, even if people leave, think about the purpose of your company. Think about the reason you joined. That can raise positivity. So there's a lot of areas to go into with this.
Yeah, for sure. So did you enjoy writing this book?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, dynamic reteaming. I love the process of writing it. It was a process of discovery.
Yeah.
Specifically discovering the 5 patterns.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you interviewed a lot of people. And I know in your new book that you're working on, you talked about you're interviewing like 50 people. Is that right?
Yeah. So I have a new book in progress on LeanPub. It's called Context Switch.
Mm-hmm.
And so far, I have already interviewed 50 VPs of engineering and CTOs about what is it like to be a senior engineering leader. Because I think just like I found myself in tech, I found myself in a VP role, and I learned a lot, and I'm in the next one. And yeah, I'm more at the beginning of that journey. And there's so many amazing leaders with so much knowledge to share that I'm a naturally curious person. And as I look back on my first experience and as I'm in my second experience, I think to myself, I'm like a sponge. I want to learn. I want to get better at this. I want to I like Clifton Strengths. It's like formerly called Gallup Strengths Finder. I do some coaching in that realm, and I'm like,
Yeah, I had Tom Rath on the show. Yeah, I had him on. Yeah, I interviewed him a couple years ago.
yeah, like one of my strengths is learner, and that's one of them, as well as input. And so I feel really good when I'm learning and talking to different people. So
Well, that's awesome. And you should definitely start a podcast then, because you can use the curiosity to ask good questions and have good guests on, because there are so many good leaders out there. It's great.
yeah, something to consider.
So your new book that you're working on, when is that scheduled to come out?
Yeah, so people can read it now. I have it on, so leanpub.com is the Steam publishing site where I released the first version of dynamic reteaming and wrote it in public.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the reason I love writing and working on books is that you can let it unfold and it kind of becomes a lifestyle. Like I write every day and I channel that all today in my book Context Switch. And so Context Switch, I think I have the Context Switch book.com points to LeanPub. But anyway, the book Context Switch has been fascinating so far, because I've met, 50 incredible leaders. And now I'm inviting other leaders to review the book in progress. I'm getting feedback on it, which has been very, very valuable. I talk about this a lot on Mastodon. So I'm on Mastodon as Heidi Helfand, and I'm talking about the process of writing this book. So it's personal reflection and anecdotes, plus what I'm learning from talking to all these leaders. So, and the title of the book, Context Switched, emerged during this process because, it was interesting. I think there's 4 contexts that you need to switch between when you become a senior leader, right? And now it's like, senior leader in engineering, senior leader in product, senior leader in design, like really that trio of work that is commonly on our cross-functional development team. So I'm talking about those senior leaders now. So that was one kind of change that evolved in this process. But there's 4 contexts you need to like get good at and switch around to be effective as a senior leader. The inward context and really how you view yourself, how you show up. You got to onboard yourself. There's a theme that came up with a lot of the senior leaders I was talking to is feeling lonely as a senior leader or being the only one from your discipline making decisions, because specifically engineering leaders, all the years before when you're, working in engineering and you're focused on your own discipline, when you become a senior leader, you're meeting with a lot of business people. You have to participate in discussions that are non-technical or different kind of technical. So there's like, how are you going to develop yourself? So there's that inward context is the first one. There's the managing up context, right? It's not just about developing your engineering team, your leaders, all of the things about your department, but it's like you're part of this wider group. You need to partner with people that you report to, people that are peers of who you report to. So how do you get better at that context of what is traditionally called like managing up, right? So there's the self context, the managing up context. There's the horizontal or peer context, right? So you have, like, if you're an engineering senior leader, you typically have a counterpart in product, maybe design, maybe some other related disciplines. So how are you going to partner with them and work together as a team? I love the first team concept from Patrick Lencioni, 5 dysfunctions of a team. I write about the, teaming with your peers in the book. So that context, how do you influence your peers and get buy-in on the ideas that you want to see happen? And then the final context, super important context is your actual discipline. If you're an engineering senior leader, your engineering team is your leaders there. You're a product leader. You've got your maybe, directors of product, group product managers. So there's your own discipline too. So what I've learned through personal experience is that if you over-index on one of these contexts and neglect the others, you will have challenges. So that a big part of being a senior leader is navigating the context switching between these different contexts. And it could feel very unnatural, especially for software engineers who've been in the flow and don't want to context switch, right? But we're not coding anymore. We're in a different realm of job. And so I found that even just that topic, there's a lack of resources for people becoming a senior engineering leader, senior tech leader. So that's why I'm pursuing this.
I think it's a great topic, and I think you're absolutely right. There's not a lot out there. I mean, there's a lot of general leadership, but there's not a lot that really focuses on that ability to. And for me, let me back up a little bit. For me, when I became, a manager and had to get into more leadership roles, it was very difficult to step away from, the code and step away from that process and actually manage the people. And, and I had a really good mentor that just looked at me one day and he's like, you don't scale. As a leader, if you have to get your hands involved in everything and you have to get in there and coding, you're not scaling. And that's not what the company needs. They don't need someone to code. They need someone that can lead. And that really stuck with me. Like, okay, I need to refocus my energy here.
Yeah. Now that sounds like really, really valuable feedback, right? Like, imagine if you didn't have that feedback. And I think that sort of leader had that development mindset to really cultivate you as the next level leader. Like that's so cool. I love hearing stories about when people make an impact like that, because look at it, it just means so much.
Yeah. Heidi, this has been a great conversation. How can people, I guess you've already talked about some of them, but how can they, follow what you're doing online and connect with you if they have any more questions or want to work with you?
Yeah, if you want to work with me, I'm really excited to be part of Artium because we can work together, right? So I offer a variety of coaching and consulting services, and the other cool thing is, can build teams with you to upskill people in your teams through pairing, through switching pairs, through a lot of the dynamic reteaming that I talk about. We have artisans in design, product, and engineering that we work together with. I also facilitate a lot of offsites. So if you want to get your teams together to talk about things, you want an external facilitator, that's one of my areas. But you can find me at HeidiHelfand.com. You can find me at thisisartium.com is Artium's website. And Heidi.Helfand at Gmail. Mastodon is the network I'm most active on these days. So,
okay, and I'll link all that up in the show notes too at geekleader.com, as well as links to the books. I really appreciate having you on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Don. I appreciate it.
Hope you enjoyed the show. Please go to geekleader.com to learn more about what this guest is up to. Click on their links and connect with them online. I would also greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. Make sure you've subscribed if you haven't already. And if you feel so inclined, you can leave me a tip by going to geekleader.com/tip.